everybody. Welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the American Revolution. This season, we're focusing on the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down, unpacking some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I'm Dr. Lynn Robbins, and I'm joined by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Thanks for being here with us today, Jim.
Great to be back as always, Lynn.
And this is a great episode to talk about. So we're on episode 6, and it's called The Proclamation. And it explores the British colonial experiment in the mid-18th century, Nova Scotia, as well as the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So I want to start with Nova Scotia, which was also at times called Acadia, and this will become important a little later. And as historian Dr. Alexandra Montgomery notes, Nova Scotia was invented in 1621. It wasn't really founded, but it was invented because the inhabitants there largely controlled the space rather than being controlled by, a grand empire. But in 1749, the Earl of Halifax decided he was going to take Nova Scotia and he was going to turn it into an experiment funded by the British Parliament. Right. So can you talk about what were his plans? What was this experiment? And how did it impact this mid-18th century view of empire and what empire was?
Yeah, Nova Scotia is a fascinating place, and it's not often a place that we associate with the American Revolution, but we have to remember before the American Revolution, there's 26 British colonies, and Nova Scotia is a pretty important one in this period. And I love the way that Alexandra frames it as an invention because, in the 17th century, the British see this landmass, or the Scots actually first, it's a Scottish venture in the 1620s, see this landmass as a place where they can go and settle and get in the colonization game. But over time, after the union with England and Scotland to create Great Britain, and after imperial competition increases with France, the British begin to see Nova Scotia and this place that's much more than the Canadian province that we think of today, but incorporates part of what is now Maine and other places in the Canadian Maritimes, as a strategic place where they can establish a colony that would act as a kind of bulwark against the French in North America and allow the British to establish a more concrete foothold that in some ways would protect New England from potential French attack. And so, but the problem is for first the Scots in the 17th century and early English and later British attempts is it all kind of goes wrong. There are colonists sent out. It doesn't really work. But this idea of a Nova Scotia, this vision of a Nova Scotia endures. And the Earl of Halifax in the 1740s, he's president of what's called the Board of Trade, this government body that manages the colonies on behalf of the British government. He emerges as a leading figure for a new kind of colonialism, one that would allow the British to exert greater control over the process of negotiation. And he sees Nova Scotia in this moment as a kind of, as Alexander describes it, a sandbox, a place where the British can go and experiment. And they, in 1749, Halifax begins to pitch this idea to Parliament that if we plant a colony here on the peninsula of Nova Scotia, it will allow us to check French aggressions established on Cape Breton Island. On Cape Breton Island, there's the fortress of Louisbourg, which is a key installation that allows the French to essentially guard access to the St. Lawrence Seaway and thereby into the heart of New France. So Halifax thinks if we can take control of Nova Scotia, we can counter French threats there, and we can also begin to experiment. We can begin to directly manage the process of colonization by organizing what this place is going to look like, organizing what kind of settlers are going to go there, funding the governors and the provincial council so they're not beholden to a colonial legislative assembly. We're going to try to re-engineer a process that in their minds has not really worked since the 17th century. And if they're going to create an empire in the way that they want, they're going to have to take greater control of it. And Nova Scotia becomes the place to try to make that happen.
So it really is a planned colony. It's not about settlers showing up and creating a home and creating a colony. It's the British literally planning it out and then planting it and saying this is how this is how this colony is going to look, exist, be run. It's very controlled.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And a kind of crude analogy is a homeowners association today, where I can't do certain things in my yard without getting approval from the homeowners association. And they always come around and are looking into your backyard to see if whether or not you've actually done what you said you're going to do, or you've cleaned your siding, like I need to do at this moment. Sort of a similar idea, right? There's this idea that settlers on their own create chaos. And if we're going to make this all work for the imperial interest, we have to have greater oversight of this process. Otherwise, chaos, hilarity, other kinds of dangerous things might ensue.
Right. So it's all about the interest of the empire, not the interest of the settlers, in other words.
Right.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about why Nova Scotia was important, but were there other reasons strategically? Was it because of the location, it being, a sort of exterior colony?
Right.
Is there a specific reason why they chose Nova Scotia? Was it just an easy one to take over?
Well, part of it was because of where Louisbourg was on Cape Breton Island. So if we think about the modern Canadian province of Nova Scotia, it's that peninsula, right? And then the island to the north is Cape Breton Island. And on the southern shore of that was the fortress of Louisbourg. Now, so you've got that situation, have that map in your head. Now, imagine that you're coming from France or you're coming from Britain to these colonies. If you're going to go to North America, there's a couple ways you could go. Say if you're going to go to the Caribbean or Virginia, there's the southern route past Africa. You cross the midsection of the Atlantic and come up. But the northern routes take you almost invariably right past Nova Scotia. So all the European shipping that is going to New France, that is possibly going to go to New England, is coming very close to Nova Scotia, very close to Cape Breton Island and that fort. And so if your desire is to have an impact on the trade with indigenous peoples in New France, then if you are somehow controlling the sea lanes into the heart of New France via the St. Lawrence Seaway, having a presence on Nova Scotia, having a presence to counter what's happening on Cape Breton Island is essential.
Right.
So Nova Scotia, in their minds, becomes very critical to ensuring a degree of safety and a degree of imperial domination in this space.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So back to how we define this new colony. The British are going to plan it out, and then they're going to plop settlers down, and they're going to have their colony. But there's one problem with that. This is not an empty land.
Right.
So there are indigenous peoples there. There are, 10,000 Catholic French Acadians, not Canadians, Acadians as well. So obviously, the British, thinking as the British, we have to get rid of them so that we have space for the settlers that we're going to plant there. And again, Dr. Montgomery, she calls this weaponized settlement, which is absolutely fascinating concept that she has come up with. And we actually have an audio clip of her talking about this. So after we listen to this clip, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about this concept and how it actually worked for the British Empire.
All right, let's take a listen.
Great.
So what I mean by weaponized settlement is when we think of settler colonialism, we think of it as something that is propelled by colonists for colonists. It is a process by which colonists create governments by them, for them, eliminate indigenous folk, both literally and rhetorically, claim their lands, that kind of a process, which is a process that we see again and again in the 18th century. The term weaponized settlement is one that I use to describe this process that I see happening in Nova Scotia and also in other places as well. And by weaponized settlement, I mean it was extremely clear to members of what I call the planning class. So this is everybody from colonial officials to all up and down the rank of officials in Britain, are very aware of the power, the dispossessive power of white self-reproducing settler populations. They see it and they like it. And the idea of weaponized settlement is you don't have colonists creating these spaces for themselves. What you have is higher up government officials looking at the land kind of like a chessboard and saying, we need more control here. We don't like the people that are living here. The way that we are going to create this without being in a wartime battle situation is we are going to strategically plant populations that are loyal to us. And that is how we will hold that land. We will take this land from the enemy without firing a shot through the awesome might of colonization.
All right. So that's a great clip about this concept of weaponized settlement. So it sounds like, in theory, it could work. So what actually happened with this, Jim? What happened with their idea of settlement?
Yeah. So, and Alexandra makes such a great distinction. It's, she and I used to work together at Mount Vernon, and one of the reasons that I was able to hire her as our postdoctoral fellow at that point was I was so impressed with how she conceptualized this idea of weaponized settlement, where, settler colonialism, it's settlers acting on their own, causing chaos, but this weaponized settlement is a kind of planned colonial objective where you essentially, in their view, dump a bunch of Protestants in a place and attempt to essentially breed out the undesirable population. You have to remember, right? In this period, it's the Catholics versus the Protestants. The British see the Catholic French as the Antichrist. And as you said, there are 10,000 Acadians on the peninsula of Nova Scotia, also a significant number of Mi'kmaq people. So the idea is we're going to found this town called Halifax, conveniently after the progenitor of this project. We're going to send over 200 or 2,500 mostly demobilized sailors and soldiers who had served in what's called the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s. It's a great, from a sort of military perspective, because you have a ready-made force, but also you are sending them and rewarding them with their service with land grants. And we're going to plop them there. We're going to plop them in this place called Halifax. And then over time, as Alexandra says in our episode, through the magic of Protestant power, the Catholic and Native population will essentially be outbred.
Right.
Doesn't work out that way, in part because they make the same mistake that the Virginia Company of London made in the 17th century. They didn't send over enough women. And reproducing populations is quite difficult when you don't have those two key components in place.
Yes, I certainly would think so. So it didn't go well, obviously. But then we have the French and Indian War, and now the British have to completely rethink their strategy in Nova Scotia. So how does the French and Indian War change this failing experiment and their strategy there?
It allows them to do something that they had kind of considered before, which was a different means of removing the Acadian population. Because what the British worry about once the war breaks out in 1754-55 is that the Catholic French Acadians, a lot of them are not swearing allegiance to the French king. Sorry, to the British king.
To the British king, understandably.
Right. And, the British had conquered Nova Scotia in 1710. They had been dealing with this population for a long time, trying this magical Protestant power. It's not really working. But the war gives them an excuse to deport all of these people. 10,000 plus Acadians are essentially, in July of 1755, ordered to leave. And through the next several months, into the next several years, population is essentially rounded up and sent to different parts of the British Empire. They are essentially dispersed through the British colonies. Some go back to France. Some go down into what is now Louisiana. That's where the term Cajun comes from.
That's right.
They are the descendants of the Acadian diaspora, all in the belief that this is a moment where we can use the pretext of war to accomplish a goal that we've been trying and failing to do. They're also worried that these French population can assist the fortress of Louisbourg and cause problems for them down the line. But this is a traumatic moment in the history of New France, in the history of Canada, that has these lingering memories still to this day. And was very grateful to shout out to the Nova Scotia Archives. They've done a lot of great digital work. They've digitized tons of their material, and you can go and read through some of the accounts and through some of the political discussions about what this is going to look like.
That's great. We'll add some of those links as well in our show notes for this, so that the listeners and viewers can go ahead and check those out as well. So I think you talk about how the main reason that this was possible, that this became possible, is because the outcome of the French and Indian War essentially meant British is now the dominant European power in much of North America.
Right.
And so certainly now, the Earl of Halifax, I almost said Fairfax, Halifax, his fears of chaos sort of came true with the French and Indian War. So now we're concerned about the chaos, and the British are the dominant power, throughout North America. So with all of this happening, we eventually end up at the Royal Proclamation of October 7th, 1763. So I don't know how many people know a lot about that proclamation. So can you maybe, walk us through how we get from, Halifax and this chaos and controlled colonies to this idea of this Royal Proclamation from King George III?
Yeah, the Royal Proclamation is a foundational document, not only in sort of the constitutional history of both the United States and Canada, but it's a formative moment in the history of British America in the 1760s. And the idea behind the proclamation is tied directly to the fears of men like the Earl of Halifax, the men like Henry Ellis and William Knox, who served in Georgia in colonial capacities in the mid-18th century. This idea that if you allow unrestrained settlement, and if you don't impose some kind of regulatory regime that marshals the energies of the empire to its best effect, then you will have persistent instability. So one of the things there that Halifax and these guys have been worried about for years is the impulse of Virginians and Pennsylvanians and South Carolinians to try to go over the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, into Indian country, settle there. And as we've been talking about through the past few episodes, those choices, that form of settler colonialism, created much of the conflict that exploded into a global war. And Halifax is like, we cannot do this anymore. They're also worried that if they essentially escape their view over the mountains, they will no longer have an affinity for being British, that the government won't be able to regulate them effectively, that the settlers may begin to manufacture their own goods and put them in competition with British manufacturers. And, this empire is an empire of trade, and so we can't be having that.
Right.
So they have these two ideas. We need to stop settlers from moving west. We need to reduce the violence between white settlers and native people. And we also want to better manage these new colonies and plan these new colonies in Nova Scotia and Florida and Quebec. All of this gets marshaled into a report prepared by the Board of Trade in June of 1763, sent to the king, sent to the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, who has oversight of the colonies in the cabinet. And the Secretary of State, the Earl of Egremont, and George III look this over, and they make a few changes. But they say essentially, what your evaluation of the situation is great. In some ways, it was no surprise that this is their conclusions they came to, because they've been thinking about it for 15 years. But once they learn that Pontiac's War has broken out, and they learn that in July of 1763, you start to see things accelerate. And the Board of Trade says in early August to the king, Your Majesty ought to issue a proclamation or some kind of injunction to stop settlers from going west, and we can begin to put this in action. So you see that happen. The Earl of Halifax comes back into this story. He becomes Secretary of State for the Southern Department in late summer of 1763. He and the Board of Trade draft this proclamation, which is about 2,000 words or so. But essentially what it does is it describes the new governments in Quebec, in the Floridas, East and West Florida. It reorganizes the administration of the island of Grenada. It provides for land grants for servicemen who had served in North America during the war. And then about 40% of that document is all about Indigenous affairs, and all tied to the idea that in order to ensure peace and mutual satisfaction between peoples in North America, white settlement essentially can no longer go past the mountains. And it's a foundational moment for Indigenous peoples, I think we'll talk a little bit about, in terms of their relationship with the British and later the Canadian governments, but also for white settlers who had very clear ideas about what they wanted to achieve in those lands. And now there is a theoretical barrier in their way.
Right. And of course, we talked about Pontiac and Pontiac's War in our previous episode. So
Sure.
refresh yourself and, you can go back and listen to that again. Once is not enough, right?
Yeah, repeatedly. It would be great. Thank you.
Just put it on repeat all day while you're at work. You'll learn something new every time.
Tell your friends. It's pretty good. Yeah.
So this proclamation, it sort of redefined the crown, the relationship between the crown and First Nations, certainly in Canada. So can you talk about how the relationships between the crown and Indigenous peoples really changed with this proclamation? I mean, this is a big deal.
Right.
This isn't just another document. This is redefining relationships with North America.
Yeah, it's a great question because, and we think about it in sort of geographic terms and political terms. So geographically, the Treaty of Peace that ends the 7 Years' War establishes the Mississippi River as the western border of British America. So the king has the claim on all those lands, and they are thinking about Indigenous peoples living in these lands as living under the king's protection. That's a phrase you would have heard. But the idea then of a proclamation that stops settlers from heading west is the latest installment of a long evolution in British thinking in which they are beginning to really see Native nations as what they would recognize as states. We wouldn't really call them that. The Indigenous peoples wouldn't really call them that. But these political entities that exist and that are sovereign in their own right. And they begin to negotiate, actually, during the 7 Years' War with Native nations like the Haudenosaunee, the Choctaw, the Cherokees, kind of on that basis. We recognize that you have certain sovereign claims. The king claims to be your great sort of benevolent overlord and protector, but we also recognize that we necessarily can't call you a part of the British nation or the British state too. What ends up happening then is the Proclamation of 1763 kind of defines how these relationships are going to work. It's still unclear, right, how the extent to which the British see Indigenous people as wholly sovereign or simply as we would say in American Indian constitutional law now, like domestic dependent sovereigns. Right. But there is then now a kind of process by which any negotiation will take place directly between the Crown's representatives and your representatives.
Right.
No longer allowing colonists to buy land from Native peoples, no longer allowing colonial governors to negotiate. This is an imperial relationship now with Indigenous peoples. And you start to see the emergence of a political philosophy that is rooted in this idea that Native nations are sovereign states or sovereign in their own right. And that survives in the ways in which first the Continental Congress and now the federal government has dealt with Native peoples in the United States. But it's fundamental to Canadian constitutionalism. It's actually written in the Canadian Constitution of 1982. And so it is a key moment both in the history of these two countries, but especially so for the Canadians because the proclamation is still a crucial guiding force in how they think about the relations with First Nations.
Right. And at the most base level, it's almost the first time they're being recognized as inhabitants of land, because before land that was inhabited by Indigenous peoples was essentially considered empty and could be settled. So they're actually being acknowledged now, which is a pretty major improvement.
Well, and you start to see cartographers in this period start to at least delineate borders between different nations. They still recognize that there's a nebulous gap there where there's between lands that are claimed for hunting grounds and lands that are quote unquote inhabited with some kind of permanence. But you start to see both sides actually kind of dealing with each other, recognizing that there's some common borders. Native peoples make maps too. A lot of those just don't survive, but evidence we have suggests that they too began to think sort of spatially about their relationship between not only other Indigenous peoples, but also settlers and the British writ large. And there's a fascinating map from the 1720s called the Catawba map, which shows how the Catawbas thought about the relationship between themselves and the city of Charleston. And you'll see all these different circles representing these different native communities, these towns, and then Charleston itself. And so it's a clear representation of how they rendered their political existence vis-a-vis a British colony.
That's fascinating. So they saw themselves as within the borders, but within their own little communities.
Yeah, I mean, kind of adjacent to, right? Since the 1720s, the Carolinians hadn't been expanded out that far yet, but sort of establishing that there are what in the Eurocentric mind would call a border at that point. And so it's really quite a fascinating document.
Oh, fantastic. Is this something that is available online digitally?
Yes, I believe it's in, there's a Library of Congress, I believe. There's at least a digital image there, but certainly we should post that in the show notes because that's
Absolutely.
a really great example of indigenous cartography from the 18th century.
Fantastic. So we will have the link to that in our show notes. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I wanted to finish with a question about sort of the long-term echoes of all of what we've been talking about. And so do we still see this concept of, the British re-envisioning empire? Is that the vision of empire that we have in our modern times? And what about globally? Was it a sort of global turn to a different idea of empire that still echoes today? Or did it not last?
Gosh, that's a hard question that someone should write a dissertation about. True.
Anyone looking for a dissertation, here you go.
Exactly. It's a great question. I mean, I think we can start by just sort of thinking through a couple ideas. I mean, on the one hand, in the United States, the federal government is very much the successor of what the British were attempting to do in the 18th century. Because the Americans, after the American Revolution, living under the Continental Congress and the Confederation government, quickly realized, or at least some of them did, like Madison and Hamilton and Washington, that if the United States, if the Union was going to survive, it needed to have in place a framework to control what they would have called the passions of the people.
Right.
Same ideas that Halifax and these guys are dealing with in the mid-18th century. There's very little sort of difference. I mean, quite honestly, sometimes it's you could simply not even look at if you took down the flags and you looked at the sort of structures of both the ideal British Empire in the 18th century and the federal government of the late 18th century, it's kind of the same thing in many real respects. There's very little daylight between those ideas. But I think also in terms of, forced removal, I think that, that has been a tool of empires throughout history. We see a very concrete example of that here in the mid-18th century with what happened to the Acadians. That has been an unfortunate side effect of empire, as many, many unfortunate side effects of empire, of course, but you still see that echo. That echo lives on in the memories of folks in that region and also in Louisiana and throughout their various communities. And so I think we do see, and of course, as we've been talking about with Indigenous nations in Canada, the proclamation is a persistent, powerful force in that constitutional arrangement. And I'm racking my brains because I was just at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, and there is an Indigenous artist, and I'm sorry I cannot remember his name, but there is a fantastic exhibit about this very sort of question, the significance of 1763, of 1789, and then the Canadian Confederation in the mid-19th century for Indigenous people. And it's a terrific art exhibit. If you happen to be in D.C., you should go see it. And it really kind of drove home for me when I saw it that the extent to which we, us in the United States, sort of forget that once the revolution creates these two nations, United States and Canada, the proclamation gets subsumed into our political culture, but we don't really think about it. But for the Canadians, it is, and particularly First Nations in Canada, it's crucial.
Well, that honestly, that was a really great answer, Jim. And I think when you get down to it, I think what we're trying to say is that it is very important for you to understand your history, your nation's history, and it is still relevant today.
Right.
It's not just, old dead names and dates, but it actually is relevant to understanding the world we live in today.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
indeed.
thanks so much for that,
Thank
Jim.
you.
I think this was a great episode. Episode 6 was great. So if you
you.
came across this but haven't listened to it, listen to it 3 more times. As for myself, please check out Too Complicated for History, our other podcast for which I'm co-host with Isaac Loftus. We have a new Patreon account. Please check out our YouTube channel, and everything we talked about in this episode we'll put in the show notes. So check those out. We'll also look for that artist that you're talking about for the Museum of the American Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything we missed, please feel free to comment, and we'll go ahead and hunt it down for you. So, Jim, if you have any final comments.
Yeah, this has been great as usual. I think, for our listeners, we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus as we recharge and hiatus with this particular show as we recharge and attend to some of our other projects. But we'll be back in about a month or so with new episodes of Revolutions Reconsidered, and we'll continue to blow your mind.
That's right. Better every time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, Jim. This was a great episode.
Thanks a lot. You've been listening to Revolutions Reconsidered with Dr. Lynn Price Robbins and Dr. Jim Ambuske. Revolutions is a co-production of Primary Source Media and R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Our producers are Patrick Long, Jeanette Patrick, Lynn Price Robbins, and Jim Ambuske. Join the revolution by heading to primarysourcemedia.com or find Primary Source Media on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.